Is it more than a state visit? France's president in China for 3 days in what could seem like the snapshot of a world order in flux. For starters, there was a press conference, which wasn't the case when Donald Trump recently visited. With the U.S. washing its hands of multilateral deals on trade and climate change, Emmanuel Macron posing as more than just the French leader. With Germany's Angela Merkel bogged down in coalition talks, the UK heading for Brexit, we'll be asking our panel if Macron makes a convincing interim king of Europe. We'll also ask about trade, China's big One Belt, One Road infrastructure initiative, sharing the burden on development, and the liberal values the West deems vital if we're to live in an interconnected world, liberal values that include the guarantee of basic human rights. Also, we'll ask what China's most powerful leader since Mao makes of Emmanuel Macron and of France. Today in the France 24 debate, Macron in China. With us to talk about it, Alice Ekman, head of China research at the French International Relations Institute, IFRI, the author of China in the World. Thanks for being with us.
You're welcome.
Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Happy New Year as well to Chunyan Li, founder of Feda Consulting, the author of Succeeding in the Chinese Market. How are you?
Yeah, fine. Thank you.
We're pleased to be welcomed as well by Andrei Lozikug-Petri, chairman and managing partner of A Capital, and it's a China Outbound Fund. Thank you for joining us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Now, when you're going on a charm offensive, it's always important to know how to get your message across and, in some cases, to speak the language.
地球再次伟大，让地球再次让伟。
Ah bah, qu'est-ce que... Bah, Alice.
Non, mais j'avais dit tiens, au moins.
Jean, c'est comme Jean, quoi.
Jean. Jean.
Jean.
Di.
Ti.
球
Sio.
再
Sai.
次
Se.
伟大。
C'est quasiment ta.
Ta. Ça descend.
Ça descend.
Ouais.
Alors, où est-ce que je respire là-dedans?
让地球再次伟大。
How did he do, Professor?
So it's 让地球再次伟大, make the planet great again.
Make the planet great again.
Yeah, right. I also.
How did he do there?
What do you mean? How
did Macron do in pronunciation?
I think he pronounced very well. I also watched the video well, in which he pronounced this sentence, in his speech, and I think the audience was very pleased about that. And we see that Macron really made efforts.
And he quipped at one point during the press conference that he'd heard that Xi Jinping's daughter is taking French as a second language, and he hopes one day that French will be the first language.
Yeah, he said that, but I think in China there are more and more people who are interested in learning French, and in France it's the same, more and more French people who are learning Chinese as well. And we see that Macron is really is really very interested in Chinese culture. And he also said that he is going to visit China every year during his mandate.
At least.
Right, at least.
All right, so we know that more and more French are learning Mandarin. That's a given. But is Chunyan being polite there when she says more and more Chinese are learning French?
Well, it's not widespread spoken in China. It's true that there is a network of Alliance Française, this school to learn French. It's true that you have, in particular, you have a significant number of Chinese diplomats who speak good French and who are working in Francophone Africa. So yes, you have, French language is something in China, but I think Macron really wants to push forward Francophonie or French-speaking. Population in China in the long term.
Okay, so you're on a charm offensive, you're on a state visit, there's the language, and of course there's the exchange of gifts. We can introduce you to Vesuve de Breca, a retired French Republican guard horse, who, by the way, has been offered to China's president, currently in quarantine. What do you think of that choice of a gift, André?
I think we really have a very innovative president. There was the panda diplomacy, now the French have the horse diplomacy.
It's not that innovative. I'm reading that Napoleon, for instance, would get gifts of horses. This is not a new tradition.
I love the comparison you're doing. But it's interesting to see because even the Chinese name of Macron, it's Macron, and it's the horse daunting the dragon. which even symbolically is interesting, because the dragon is always seen or sometimes seen as the symbol for China. So Ma is the horse in Chinese. So he's personifying pretty much the diplomacy. Looks a little bit like En Marche. Remember, En Marche was EM, the same initials like Emmanuel Macron.
Yeah. What's more, I want to add that the horse has a very good meaning in Chinese. The horse is a symbol of success in China, and also we have some Chinese proverbs which shows the meaning, the good meaning of the horse. For example, when the horse arrives, the success is gained.
When the horse arrives, the success is gained. And we heard Macron waxing lyrical about what the word harmony means and getting into almost a philosophical discussion about Oriental philosophy.
Yeah.
Do you think he may have perhaps overstretched it a bit, the charming?
I don't think so. From my point of view, I think first of all, Macron is somebody who loves history and who loves reading. And China is a country with more than 5,000 years, and also he discovers China for the first time. There is Xi'an is a very beautiful and historical city, and in Beijing as well. So there is also very good basis of the friendship between our two countries. I don't think it's overstretched.
So contrast that with that visit by Donald Trump, where the charm offensive was laid out, but not by Trump, but by his hosts, who really put out the parade and the tea at the Forbidden City and all of that. But it wasn't a two-way street then.
No, but you're right to mention Trump's visit, because charm and symbols are fully part of Macron's diplomacy. He also he hosted Putin at Versailles, and he plays on symbols quite a lot, not just after the panda diplomacy, then there would be the horse diplomacy. So the play of the symbol.
But is it too heavy-handed?
It's interesting to see if it's only this or there is something more, if there is content behind the charm. What I feel and what I've been analyzing, looking closely at his main speech yesterday, is that it's a mix of charm and frankness. Charm is there, play on symbol is fully there. The lengthy paragraph on our long civilization and culture, etc., etc. Something, it may sound a bit heavy, but at the same time, one or two paragraphs after, you have a rather direct and rather firm position on market access and reciprocity. So this mix is interesting because it seems it's fully engaged in both paths, and this indicates that he's quite aware of the domestic political situation, social situation in China. I don't think that Macron is blind. I don't think that French diplomacy is blind. I think he's fully aware of the complexity of dealing with China, and also I think he's playing himself on paradox. And this play on paradox is interesting because China itself has a kind of paradoxical diplomacy. So I found it extremely interesting to see how Macron is putting on track these bilateral relations, because he's clearly showing his determination. At the same time, in his very lengthy speech of yesterday, as you mentioned, at the end it became quite philosophical, and it developed a few paragraphs on what is an individual, what is a person, and how beautiful it is to be unique. And in China, you have more than 1 billion persons who think and feel and express themselves potentially differently, and this difference makes it beautiful. So saying this in front of Xi Jinping,
so is this
it's an introductory paragraph to talk about human rights. Clearly, I mean, so you see.
But he stayed at the introductory paragraph.
Yeah, I mean, it's introductory speech at the end of the introductory speech, but it's there, right? And then you have a week-long conversation, or you have closed-door exchanges, more specifically on dissidents. So it's firm and it's frankness and seduction at the same time, clearly.
Is that the best you can do publicly when you're the president of France? We've seen past U.S. presidents, even German chancellors who've openly criticized China over Tibet, over human rights. Is that the best a French president can do?
I think even before the human rights or Tibet, my very personal opinion is that this has never really worked. I think symbols are important, respect is important. I think Macron's really coined a new form of diplomacy where he respected Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, now Xi Jinping in their own way.
And does it work? Your experience as a businessman, does it work, this kind of flattery, this mix of flattery and frankness?
I think if at the end you are not able to show not just frankness, because with China, the only thing which counts is strength. If you're not in a situation of strength, you are you don't count. And a good example is whatever people think of Donald Trump, and probably less respect they have in front of Trump than in front of Macron as a person, it was not Xi Jinping who welcomed Emmanuel Macron yesterday in this forbidden city. Donald Trump had the honor of having a guide in the person of the Chinese president. Yesterday we didn't see that. So clearly France is 1 or 2 levels below. So until we don't reset completely the relationship by having maybe a more European approach, because Europe is something that is much more important for China because it's 30% of Chinese exports, just to state this.
Otherwise put, France has 1 aircraft carrier. The United States has something like, 11? Until we build more, it's not going to be Xi Jinping who gives you the tour of the Forbidden City?
I think I agree with what André has just said. The negotiations or the collaborations between 2 countries depend a lot on the strength and the size of both countries. But however, I still see many mutual interests and some common opportunities to be developed between
let's talk about that. And also, let's hear what Xi Jinping had to say at their joint press conference. He backed a bigger role for France in European integration, and he also said that as a fellow member of the UN Security Council, Xi spoke of partnering with France in a changing global landscape.
China and France have agreed to reinforce our international cooperation in every domain and to work together to defend multilateralism, to improve global governance, and to respond to global challenges, including climate change and terrorism.
Does he mean what he says, or is this just, a way to flatter the visitor?
I think it does, but we have to put it in perspective and not take into account China-US rivalry. So sorry, but I didn't know we were on it. But I think yes, it does mean this. At the same time, China
it's to stick the knife into the Americans as well.
China has played on multipolarity for a long time. So having a strong France has always been in China's mindset, China's diplomacy mindset, in the interest of China, because it counterbalances the weight of the United States. And we have to say China's diplomacy has an obsession with the US and China's...
With or without Trump?
With or without Trump. And actually Trump is seen as an opportunity from Beijing because of its ambiguity and because China can fill the void of multilateralism and can present itself as a more responsible stakeholder in relation with climate change or other major global challenge. So for Xi Jinping here, I think there is nothing new, but I think what is new is the determination of Macron to play a role in multilateralism. France will organize more high-level multilateral summits. There was a One Planet Summit. There will be more summits on global governance in the coming years, summit on terrorism and terrorism financing in the coming months. And China has been doing a lot of also forum organization, multilateral summit organization in recent years. And now it realized that it is not the only one to be at the initiative in this field. So there will be interesting competition, both in existing multilateral summits and forums, but also in the one that are created by both France and China. Will China and France cooperate on some issue? Will they compete? I think both depends really on the issue.
And again, when Xi Jinping says that he's for a stronger France that plays a bigger role in a more integrated Europe, does he really is he really rooting for a more integrated Europe?
I'm not so sure, because China has been investing in regional cooperation in Europe. You know, China created sub-regional forums, such as 16+1, which is a forum created at the initiative of China in 2012, which gathered Central and Eastern European countries. China also had the plan of creating a similar sub-regional forum in Southern Europe, involving 6 European countries and not necessarily France. And China still has a plan of creating a similar cooperation framework in Northern Europe. And all this without necessarily the association or the support of the EU. China considers that does not have to wait or to follow the rules of the EU in this context, and China can interact in the format it wishes. So I don't think necessarily China is contributive to a cohesive Europe. No. What I think, though, is that, as you mentioned, Europe is important for China. For sure, Europe, not necessarily the EU, but Europe as a market, Europe as part of one of the on the important region for its so-called Belt and Road Initiative, etc.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that up till now, Britain was sort of the go-to country for China inside the EU?
Yeah, but due to the Brexit, I think France can play a bigger role in the relationship between China and Europe. Especially China expect to exercise greater influence in the world and in Europe. And there are more and more Chinese investment abroad, including in Europe. So I think China expects France to play a role of a kind of sponsor in Europe, to refixing some kind of trade rules or in creating an environment favorable to Chinese investment.
Well, I think until the European countries understand that their weight is close to zero compared to China, until they get united, then I think we will have made a big step forward. And as you said, I mean, Britain was, what was it called? It was a diamond or golden area that was opening up. Nothing is talked about that anymore. Germany was the big friend for a long time until since 2 years ago, the Germans getting very nervous about strategic acquisitions by the Chinese. Now it's France. I think where I see a huge opportunity is maybe mixing Macron's vision, true vision. I mean, he's the first president of France for a long time that has been elected on a European mandate, and especially a French-German mandate. And
so it's to mix his European mandate
and mixing that with a common strategy toward China, that would be something very powerful, and where obviously China would have to respond.
All right, we'll pick up on these points when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Here at France 24, we're taking a broad outlook by talking about the women who are reshaping our world.
في فرانس 24 لا ننسى ونحجز لكم أسبوعيا تذكرة عودة للمدن والمناطق التي كانت في قلب الأحداث قبل أن تدخل في طي النسيان.
France 24, c'est la recherche permanente des meilleurs spécialistes pour vous permettre de déchiffrer l'actualité.
أخبار سياسية واقتصادية وثقافية وأيضا رياضية بأعين خبراء رياضيين. هذه هي قناة فرانس 24.
Eye on Africa, presented by Georgia Calvin-Smith.
Africa News, and your eyes on Africa. And bringing you the latest from across the continent.
Eye on Africa, on France 24 and France24.com.
We are journalists, and normally you have to listen to us, but you have things to tell us too. Maybe you've experienced a dramatic event, or you've got something important to say. You want to make a difference. That is why we created The Observers. Now, the first step is very easy. You get in touch with our team. Send us your images, tell us what you've seen. And then it's our job to get your voice out there, on our site, on social networks, on your mobiles and tablets, and on TV, of course. You can appear in our weekly show via webcam. Or perhaps we'll come see you in person, where you live, in your country, your town, and we'll work together on a report for our investigative show, The Observers Direct. So you get the idea. This show is your show, your way to get your voice out to the world.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. The United States to send a high-level delegation to the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics in South Korea. The announcement coming after North Korea confirmed its participation in next month's games. In Tunisia, the main opposition party calls for fresh protests against austerity. This after Monday's demonstrations in several cities leave one dead. Poland's new prime minister in Brussels after a cabinet reshuffle, billed as a fence-mending exercise to avoid EU sanctions. Warsaw's nationalist government under fire over its judicial overhaul, most notably. Computer chip maker Intel vows to fix 90% of its processors within weeks and avoid a mass recall. Some are skeptical. Kate Moody will have all the day's business news. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and the French president in China for a 3-day state visit, sort of a way to illustrate how the New World Order is changing or not. We're talking about it with Alice Ekman, who's the head of China research at IFRI, the French International Relations Institute, the author of China in the World, Chunyan Li, founder of Theta Consulting, and the author of Succeeding in the Chinese Market, André Lezakog-Petri, chair and managing partner at A Capital, China Outbound Fund. Thank you, all three of you, for being with us. Emmanuel Macron, we're in the middle of his state visit. It began on Monday with a trip to the central city of Xi'an, the starting point of the old Silk Roads, the contemplation of ancient terracotta masterpieces. A reminder that there's a new Silk Road. It's been touted by China since 2013. It's the $1 trillion One Belt, One Road infrastructure project. Now, what was interesting was it proved a chance for Macron to try and get the Chinese more involved in ensuring security, with getting them to participate in the G5 Sahel patrolling of the Sahara against jihadists, and development on the African continent.
France has the experience of unilateral imperialism in Africa, which sometimes had the worst consequences. And today, with the new Silk Road being created, I think that the partnership between France and China can avoid to repeat these mistakes, and especially choose a path of fairness that I am evoking here today.
André Lezakog-Petri, the words of Emmanuel Macron, is that going to work, getting the Chinese more involved in footing the bill to keep Africa safe?
Well, I think China did not wait for France to invest heavily in Africa. I mean, there was this famous railroad that was built decades ago, and China, 10 years ago, put Africa back on the map. When China began to invest massively in Africa, suddenly the US and Europe, which retreated in the last 20 or 30 years, became aware, wow, there's competition going on. I actually like the way Macron put it, because it's also it's an invite for cooperation with China to do some things together in Africa, but it's also a very clear threat. We did a mistake in the past. If you don't take the step of fairness, and you know how much critics is sometimes given to China about its investments overseas, you will repeat the same mistakes with all the consequences that we still have to bear.
Yeah.
Do ordinary Chinese, will they listen to that? Will they hear what the way André interpreted it?
Yeah, but I think from Chinese point of view, I think Macron is right because historically France understands better the culture in Africa, and Chinese companies when they invest abroad, they often lack experience, in the international project management and also in the adaptation to the local culture. So in Africa, for example, I think we can combine the strengths of both countries, the funding and the workforce of China, for example, with the expertise and the international project management experience of France.
It's a national security interest now, the way Macron described it when there was that EU-Africa summit. More development to Africa means stopping the waves of immigration, stopping terrorism, and they're the call for the Chinese to get more involved.
Security. Well, the thing is that for more than 4 years now, the Chinese, and even longer, as much as I recall, Chinese think tank, Chinese officials have approached their counterpart in France, in particular, to gain expertise on the African continent. They are fully conscious that they have to learn from France, on several.
Yeah, we saw concrete examples in places like Zambia and Angola where there was an anti-China backlash.
Well, especially Francophone Africa, so including Maghreb, Northern Africa, but also Senegal, in many countries in Francophone Africa. So China is really, from Deng Xiaoping onwards, has been keen to learn from other countries, to gain access in promoting its interests abroad, first of all, economic interests. So far it has been quite one way in terms of helping, not helping, but jointly working together to gain access in good condition, in good terms, on the African continent. At the same time, I think France would like to see more involvement in terms of fighting terrorism on the side of China. China has been very much involved in developing its military capabilities, including creating a base in Djibouti, and China is very much concerned about the safety of its citizens on the African continent. It had to evacuate, including by military means, several of its citizens over
most notably in Libya.
Libya was a turning point and was a shock for Chinese diplomacy as a PLA, the People's Liberation Army, because it was about the evacuation last minute of more than 35,000 citizens. And this was new for China, because imagine the Chinese diplomacy did not know how many citizens it had in the territory. So this was a learning event. And after that, for example, Chinese diplomacy counted much better the amount of citizens present in Algeria, for instance, or in other countries who might at some point be unstable politically and which may have consequences on the safety of its citizens. So China is aware, is concerned about the safety of its citizens, and this is a main mission of one of the key missions of Chinese diplomacy in the period today. Is also concerned about the loss of investment. Libya was also shocked because Chinese companies lost an enormous amount of money in the energy sector in particular. So for that, China is pushing now under the so-called Belt and Road packaging, is pushing for trilateral cooperation with France on African territories to jointly develop, for example, projects being like infrastructure projects, so that it's with the right risk assessment, right anticipation to limit the risk of investing in these countries.
And Emmanuel Macron clearly putting strings on that during this trip when he said that he wants more accountability when it comes to, he wants to help in developing One Belt, One Road. He wants the EU more involved, but he wants accountability. And that accountability is something that came up in trade conversation. France, as we were mentioning earlier, has always been dwarfed by neighboring Germany. Catherine Viette has more on the challenges facing the French.
For the past 20 years, bilateral trade between France and China has been steadily increasing, from about 10 billion euros in 1995 to 70 billion euros currently. France is China's fourth largest trading partner in the EU, while China is France's most important partner in Asia. That's led to a trade deficit to the tune of 30 billion euros in 2016, an issue the French president is expected to raise on his state visit as he seeks to rebalance trade relations with Beijing.
Now we need to work to bring our views together and to establish a common language when we talk about trade between nations.
The French government wants to see the same access to the Chinese market for French companies that the Asian powerhouse enjoys in Europe. Like other foreign powers, France has long complained about Beijing's complicated rules for foreign investments, compulsory joint ventures with local companies, and demands for technology transfers. Despite following the rules, French car makers have had limited success in grabbing a slice of the world's biggest auto market. Macron's visit comes as the EU and Beijing are locked in a trade dispute at the WTO over whether China should be recognized as a market economy after 15 years. The EU has argued that Beijing has failed to keep its promise of curtailing the government's role in the economy.
Yeah, it's interesting because at the beginning of the show, André, we talked about human rights and the veiled way in which Macron broached the subject. Here you heard his words in that report, a common language when we talk about trade. It's kind of the corollary lecturing about human rights. How far is he going to get with that statement?
Well, what I thought interesting, and that is also very new, is Macron obviously is a very strong individual politician, but you probably saw how his foreign minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, and Bruno Le Maire today in Beijing. Jean-Yves Le Drian was a couple of days ago. He said, we want win-win with China, but we don't want that the win and win goes both to the same country with a clear... that was the first time you heard from a diplomat such an undiplomatic language. And today, Bruno Le Maire in Beijing said, we are going to reinforce the investment control.
Yeah, this is the finance and economy minister.
So it's pretty incredible to see how Macron is delivering, I would say, a pretty diplomatic message, but his ministers, I mean, you see that there is really a separation, a bit the good cop, bad cop kind of attitude, and I think that's the first time I see that playing as a team.
Tell it to us straight, though. When you get that from the foreign minister, from the economy minister, does it go in one ear and out the other?
Yeah, this is something different from the political games in China, because China will always hear the very consistent messages. But I think if we look at what the minister has said about the more control about Chinese investments, I think this is something good, both for China and for France. Even China wants that. For example, this year, the Chinese investment abroad has decreased at more than 30%. Different from last year. We had a growth of 40% in 2016. But why? Because there are many irrational investments of China abroad, and China wants to exercise a more strict control over that. So I think even for the Chinese interest...
when you say China wants to have more control over that, is that the Chinese state or is that private individuals?
State, and yeah.
Alice Ekman.
I'm not sure Chinese government would like to see more screening of its investment conducted by its state enterprises on the European market. And that's what the Commission is proposing today, or at least a mechanism to coordinate among EU member states to better assess if this or that investment is risky for national sovereignty, or if you look at national interest. So here, at least you have an intent to have more coordination at the EU level, to put forward a proposal which is, in fine, which is at the end of the day targeting Chinese investment, because there is a real concern within Europe. Not just in France, but in Germany with KUKA, the robotic company bought by Chinese companies. There is a real concern about the consequences of an increase of Chinese investment in areas that are perceived as sensitive for national sovereignty, in particular when China invests in energy grid in southern Europe, for instance, or in port infrastructure. We should not be paranoid at the same time. This
I was going to say, is that concern justified?
But that's why a screening or assessment might be interesting, an assessment framework. Some countries like France have already such a mechanism for investment concerning national territory, and some in Europe do not, such as the Netherlands. So there is a debate now within the EU about the interest, the significance of such screening, and should it be adopted. But for sure there is a concern about some of Chinese investment, and there is also a concern. It's not just about the nature of the investment; it's about the coordination of such investments, because we are aware that most of these investments are supported by the Chinese government. So there is first on one side a concern about unfair competition, but at the same time there is also a concern about, even if it's a private sometime investment, if behind the state is there, then it's a leverage for the state in some cases to play ultimately in the interest of political discussion or position of a specific country, like Hungary or Greece, who are reluctant to approve EU Commission document on the South China Sea. So you have here a concern about the link between Chinese investment, the increase of Chinese investment, and the position of some EU member states toward issues that China considers as part of its core interest. So we should not, once again, it's not about paranoia, but there is a debate is there in the EU. So how to address this debate, which mechanism, that's the question.
Some have gone as far as to say, for instance, when China's economy relatively slowed down, that there was dumping of steel which then hit hard Britain, and that you could say one of the reasons for Brexit is the feeling that Europe had abandoned them in the face of Chinese competition. I don't know if that's an overstretch or not, but does China in a way undermine the EU?
Well, what is true is that we talked about the One Belt, One Road initiative. What is very often overlooked that one of the reasons for the plan is also to, instead of doing austerity, which was the typical European way, the way that China went out of overcapacity, which was its huge issue in the last 5 years, was actually to put this overflow into foreign countries. And a lot of the One Belt, One Road is how do we overflow, export the surplus in cement, in concrete, in steel that we are producing at home. So it's a big infrastructure. It has obviously a development goal for the countries around China. It has a goal of overflow, and obviously it has a geopolitical role, like Alice Ekman just said. But just maybe on the investments, I think it's correct that there is a limitation now in China over overflow of investment, because there was an exuberance. A lot of private entrepreneurs, especially, were exporting money, actually basically channeling private money outside. But as far as strategic investments, I mean, look what has just been banned in the US. In the US, MoneyGram, that Alibaba wanted to buy, very critical in the fund transfer that was banned by the US CFIUS. And also there was a very famous semiconductor company which is critical for national security, Lattice Computer, that was also banned. I think on that one, the Europeans should not be naive anymore, because there is a technological war at play right now.
Yeah, I want to say that the restrictions of the investment exist in China as in France and in Europe. In France, Chinese companies also have difficulties in entering into some infrastructure or very key important sectors. So I think regarding the Chinese investment abroad in Europe or in France, we need to take a new look at that. For me, it's at the same time opportunity. It's not only a threat to French economy.
On this, we must recognize that there is asymmetry, lack of reciprocity, and I think you would agree with me that public procurements are not open for foreign investment, right? Yeah. A French company cannot bid to build a bridge or railway on the Chinese territory, and the list of what China considers as strategic fields, it's much longer than the list of France, and that's the sectors that France do not. I mean, there is real asymmetry even now, in terms of
a real asymmetry. And yet, last year at Davos, Xi Jinping was the guest star, was the big rock star speaker of the World Economic Forum. This year, it's going to be one Emmanuel Macron. Which one, and both in a way will be cheered in the same way, because neither of them is Donald Trump, right?
That will be very interesting to listen and compare the two speeches side by side, because my forecast is that they will use the same words, more or less. Xi Jinping talked about economic globalization, if I remember well. He talked about development in his speech. His speech was rather consensual, rather soft-spoken, and Emmanuel Macron will necessarily, I think, follow the same type of language. But what is interesting to note is that they mean completely different things. Now we have been witnessing, what I call a definition gap, is that more and more China has softened its discourse, international discourse, not necessarily domestic discourse, but abroad it is more. For example, many senior leaders are advised by international PR company, public relation company, to make the speech appealing to a Western audience. But this doesn't mean that on the content that China is following, at least is understanding what it has the same definition attached to the words that are commonly accepted in multilateral forums. So that gap should be, I think, acknowledged for the sake of everyone and for better communication.
André Pietri, you agree that when it comes to the language of the speech we'll hear from Emmanuel Macron, it will be very similar to what we heard a year ago in Davos?
Well, I had the privilege to be in Davos last year and to hear firsthand. It was interesting because probably 2/3 of the room had little experience of China. There were like 3,000 people. And the third that has lived or has worked extensively in China went out of it flabbergasted, saying, how can a Chinese president become the main advocate for free trade when we all know that it's actually today the country where the reciprocity is not at play. I mean, people in Paris just have to see, we are seeing flourishing bike companies out of China now expanding bikes everywhere in the streets of Paris since a couple of weeks. Uber was
these bike share companies.
These bike share companies, two Chinese companies, and they're now everywhere. In just in a matter of weeks, Uber was kicked out of China, literally. So you see this kind of so we're not talking about traditional old-style companies. We're talking about the new frontier, which is technology. So I think it's very important that this definition gap. I still have hope, because I think Macron has first the leadership to do so. China knows they need Europe, and today he's that was your initial statement, the current king of Europe.
Interim king.
The interim king of Europe. And I think Africa will be a key metric to see if China really means it. Why? Because our presence, our French presence in Africa is about really development, I would say really extrovert development for Africa. It's our national interests, and it's also because it has to be linked with the migrant story. What happens in Africa will have consequences with the migrant story. This is very different for China. China will not have migrants from Africa coming in the same ways that Europe endures it. And will China only look for its interest, what it has done for the last 30 years, or will it genuinely invest as a global power for Africa? That will be, for me, the key metric to see that China is changing.
All right, stay tuned. We'll have to leave it there. Chunyan Li, I want to thank you. I want to thank André Pietri, as well as Alice Ekman. Stay with us because Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois. So a lot of buzz about this official trip, and we'll start with some of the items that have been going viral to a certain extent online. Emmanuel Macron tweeting that, make our planet great again in Chinese, and there's a whole video there where he's getting a lesson in how to do it.
Yeah, Chunyan gave him the seal of approval on his pronunciation.
Right. But top marks for effort, at least, and apparently top marks for the result as well. And some various people have been reacting to that. The Chinese are particularly sensitive to efforts to speak Mandarin, and this one person who is a Mandarin speaker is saying that, errors are forgiven for the most part, and that this was actually a secret weapon of de Gaulle. He would always, on his official visits, have a few phrases in the language of the country ready. And one person here, the same person here, is saying that this is another sans faute for Macron, another top marks. Another top marks effort, and of course some promotion as well of the French language, which has, I think it's something like 150,000 people learning it in China, or maybe it's even 120,000 students of the French language in China, and efforts to promote the French language while he was there, speaking as well about the advantages of speaking French for the China-Africa relationship as well, where I think the statistics are that by the end of by the middle of this century, 700 million people will be speaking it, and 85% of that, of those French speakers will be on the African continent, where, of course, China has increasing interests. Another student here looking at this visit closely, saying that he thought that Macron's vision was too limited to Europe, and he had some issues with his vision, but actually in seeing how he has performed here in China, and in particular with a discourse that is very much defensive of the French language, this is another sans faute. So that expression coming back again, a lot of people approving of that approach. And then, of course, there's the famous horse diplomacy. Yeah. That has been getting a certain amount of headlines here in Britain's Telegraph, also in The Guardian. Vesuvius and a lot of different media in France also speaking about that. So that seems to have been a decision by Emmanuel Macron himself, and it seems to have gone down quite well, even though poor Vesuvius is currently in quarantine for the foreseeable future. But quite a focus on the lineage of Vesuvius, the fact that the maternal grandfather was a world champion at one point, all of that. So quite a sort of an elitist, I suppose, accent to all of that, but certainly it has gone down well. And apparently,
a good pedigree.
Yes, exactly. And apparently Xi Jinping was fascinated by the French Republican Guard during a visit to Paris in 2014, so perhaps that also inspired Emmanuel Macron's decision to hand over a horse. And of course, the whole notion of panda diplomacy, which is indeed even a hashtag. This was a panda given to Indonesia a few months back for a 10-year loan, it seems, so the panda has to be returned. Horse diplomacy is doing less well as a hashtag, Francois, you'll be sad to learn, but there was one previous incident of horse diplomacy when Barack Obama gave a rocking horse to Prince George. So there you go, this is a second installment in the annals of horse diplomacy, which is soon to be expanded, but it hasn't taken off as a hashtag. It has in French a little, diplomatie du cheval, and I found this cartoon, which is maybe funny. That's a cheval de Troie, a Trojan horse with Nicolas Hulot in the role.
Sometimes beleaguered ecology minister.
That's right, in the role of Trojan horse. I suppose a reference there to Macron's attempts to put a certain amount of pressure through this through horse diplomacy or whatnot to get a certain degree of satisfaction on other issues. And of course, a lot of talk as well about the choice of Xi, and a lot of Chinese Twitter accounts which are allowed to tweet, the ones that are allowed to tweet, saying that France is interested in playing a part in the new Silk Road. So clearly that choice of France being there, Macron going to Xi first, was all very carefully chosen.
All right, many thanks for that, James Creed. And I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.